In the harsh Wyoming territory of 1893, a broken cowboy's simple act of kindness would change everything. Jack Rayner had learned to keep his distance from people. The war had taught him that caring only led to loss. His small homestead barely scraped by, but it was quiet, and quiet was all he wanted after the things he'd seen. Then came the storm that brought Clara Whitmore and her silent boy to his door. She claimed to be just a widow traveling west, nothing more. But wealthy widows don't usually walk through blizzards with calloused hands and desperate eyes. Jack didn't ask questions. He'd learned not to pry into other people's pain. Then came the storm that brought Clara Whitmore and her silent boy to his door. She claimed to be just a widow traveling west, nothing more. But wealthy widows don't usually walk through blizzards with calloused hands and desperate eyes. Jack didn't ask questions. He'd learned not to pry into other people's pain.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wind howled through the valley like a banshee, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a hard winter ahead. Jack Rayner pulled his coat tighter as he made his way from the barn to the small cabin that had been his home for the better part of a decade. The storm had been building for hours, and he could feel it in his bones, the kind of weather that kept a man indoors and made him grateful for a warm fire and a roof that didn't leak. He paused at his door, listening to the wind tear through the pines that bordered his property. In the distance, he could hear the nervous lowing of his cattle, huddled together against the cold. Tomorrow, if the storm passed, he'd need to check on them, make sure none had wandered off or gotten themselves into trouble. But tonight, there was nothing to do but wait it out. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with his own hands from logs he'd cut and shaped himself. It wasn't much to look at a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. But it was his, and that meant something to a man who'd spent too many years sleeping in tents and muddy trenches, never knowing if he'd wake up to see another dawn. Jack hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved to the fireplace, where the flames were already beginning to die down. He added another log, watching as the sparks flew up the chimney and disappeared into the darkness. The warmth felt good against his face, and he stood there for a moment, letting it soak into his bones. He was a man of 43 years, though. The lines around his eyes and a gray threading through his dark hair made him look older. The war had aged him, as it had aged all the men who'd survived it. But it was more than that. It was the weight of the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the friends he'd lost. It was the knowledge that he'd been good at killing, better than most, and the shame that came with that particular talent. Jack moved to the window and peered out into the storm. The glass was frosted over, but he could see the faint outline of his fence line, the posts barely visible through the driving snow. Beyond that, the world disappeared into a lull of white. It was on nights like this that the loneliness crept in, when the silence of the cabin seemed to press against him like a living thing. He'd chosen this life, chosen the isolation and the quiet. After the war, after the hospitals and the questions, and the medal they'd tried to give him, he'd headed west like so many others. But unlike the fortune seekers and homesteaders, he hadn't come looking for gold or land or a new beginning. He'd come looking for a place to disappear, a place where the ghosts of the past couldn't follow. The homestead had been abandoned when he'd found it, the previous owner long gone, and the cabin falling into ruin. Jack had spent the better part of a year fixing it up, replacing the roof, chinkling the gaps between the logs, building the barn and the corrals. It was honest work, the kind that left a man tired but satisfied at the end of the day. And slowly, over the years, he built something resembling a life. He kept a few head of cattle, enough to sell a calf or two in town when he needed supplies. He had a small garden where he grew vegetables, and he hunted when the mood struck him. The nearest neighbor was more than 10 miles away, and the small town of Clearwater was a half-day's ride. It was the kind of isolation that might drive some men mad, but for Jack, it was a blessing. He turned away from the window and moved to the small wooden chest that sat at the foot of his bed. Inside, wrapped in an old piece of cloth, was a medal bronze, and heavy, with a ribbon that had faded to a dull blue. The Medal of Honor, they'd called it, the highest decoration a soldier could receive. He'd earned it at Antietam, they said, for leading a charge that had saved his regiment. But Jack remembered it differently. He remembered the blood and the screaming, the way the ground had been so thick with bodies that you couldn't walk without stepping on someone. He remembered the face of the young Confederate soldier he'd killed with his bare hands. A boy who couldn't have been more than 16. Jack closed the chest and pushed the memories away. That was the past, and the past was something he'd left behind. He'd built a life here in the wilderness, a life without complications or entanglements, a life where he could be useful without being a hero, where he could live without the weight of other people's expectations. He was making his way to the table, thinking about the coffee he'd brew and the book he'd read before bed, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was there. A voice, calling out in the darkness. Jack froze, his hand halfway to the coffee pot. He'd lived in this valley for 10 years, and he'd never heard another human voice on a night like this. For a moment, he wondered if he was imagining it, if the loneliness had finally gotten to him. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, a woman's voice, high and desperate. He grabbed his coat and hat, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face and stealing his breath. He pulled his hat down low and walked toward the sound, his boots crunching through the snow that was already ankle-deep. At the edge of his property, where the fence line met the old trail that led to town, he saw them. A woman and a child, huddled together against the storm. The woman was tall and slender, dressed in a dark coat that was already heavy with snow. The child, a boy, by the look of him, was pressed close to her side, his face buried against her shoulder. "Help us," the woman called out when she saw him. "Please, we're lost." Jack hesitated for a moment, old instincts warring with newer ones. He'd learned to be cautious, to keep his distance from strangers and their problems. But these weren't strangers looking for trouble. They were a woman and child, alone in a storm that could kill them both. He approached them slowly, his hands held out where they could see them. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady despite the wind. "Let's get you inside." The woman looked up at him, and even in the dim light, he could see the gratitude in her eyes. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 35, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and now whipped around her face. Her eyes were green, he noticed, and there was something in them that spoke of strength and determination. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was cultured, refined in a way that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. "I'm Clara Whitmore, and this is my son, Tommy." The boy looked up at Jack with wide, serious eyes. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old, with his mother's dark hair and a face that was too solemn for his age. He didn't speak, didn't even nod, just stared at Jack with an intensity that was unsettling. "Jack Rayner," he said, then gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, let's get you both warmed up." He led them through the storm to his door, noting how the woman moved with a grace that seemed natural, despite her exhaustion. She held the boy's hand tightly, and Jack could see the way she kept glancing around, as if she expected someone to step out of the storm and challenge them. Inside the cabin, Jack lit the oil lamp and stirred the fire back to life. The woman and boy stood near the door, dripping snow onto his floor, and he could see them both shivering. "Sit by the fire," he said, pulling out one of his chairs. "I'll get you some coffee, and there's soup if you're hungry." Clara Whitmore sat down heavily, pulling her son close to her side. "You're very kind," she said. "We've been walking for hours. I thought we were going to die out there." Jack poured coffee into 2 cups, adding sugar to one and watering it down. "For the boy, what brings you out in weather like this?" he asked, handing her the cup. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and took a sip before answering. "We were traveling to California," she said. "Our wagon broke down about 5 miles back, and our guide, he left us, said it wasn't worth the risk." Jack frowned. "Left you in this storm?" Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of pain or fear. "He was afraid," she said simply. "And I suppose I can't blame him. This isn't his problem." But Jack could see there was more to the story than she was telling. The woman's clothes, despite being travel-worn, were well-made and expensive. Her hands, though work-roughened, had the look of someone unaccustomed to hard labor. And there was something about the way she held herself, the way she spoke, that suggested she was used to being in control of her circumstances. The boy, Tommy, hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived. He sat pressed against his mother's side, his eyes darting around the cabin as if he were memorizing every detail. When Jack offered him the watered-down coffee, he took it with a small nod, but didn't drink. "How long since you've eaten?" Jack asked. "This morning," Clara said. "We had some bread and cheese, but it's long gone." Jack moved to the stove and ladled soup into 2 bowls. It was simple fair beans and salt pork with a few vegetables from his garden, but it was hot and filling. He set the bowls on the table and gestured for them to eat. Clara ate gratefully, but Jack noticed she kept glancing at her son, who was picking at his food without much interest. The boy's silence was unnerving, and Jack found himself wondering what had happened to make a child so withdrawn. "You can stay the night," Jack said. "The storm should pass by morning, and then I can help you get to town." Clara looked up at him, surprise clear in her eyes. "That's very generous, but we couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," Jack said. "I've got blankets, and the fire will keep you warm. Better than being out in the storm." She was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "Why are you helping us? You don't know anything about us." Jack considered the question. It was a fair one, and he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've been where you are. Lost in a storm?" "Lost," he said simply. Clara smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, making her look younger and softer. "Thank you, Mr. Rayner, more than you know." Jack nodded and busied himself with making up a bed for them on the floor near the fire. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. The woman Clara was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also something else. Wariness, maybe, or fear. And the boy continued his silent vigil, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. When the makeshift bed was ready, Jack excused himself and stepped outside to check on his animals. The storm was still raging, but it felt less fierce now, as if it were beginning to wear itself out. He stood in the doorway of the barn, listening to the wind and thinking about the woman and child in his cabin. There was something about them that didn't quite fit. Clara Whitmore spoke like an educated woman, carried herself like someone accustomed to authority. But she was traveling alone with a child, in the middle of winter, with no apparent destination beyond California. And the boy's silence suggested trauma of some kind, the kind that came from seeing or experiencing something no child should have to endure. Jack had learned long ago not to pry into other people's business. The frontier was full of people running from something, and most of them had good reason. But as he stood there in the storm, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara Whitmore and her son were running from something particularly dangerous. He returned to the cabin. He found them both asleep by the fire, Clara's arm wrapped protectively around her son. In sleep, the worry lines around her eyes had softened, and she looked younger, more vulnerable. The boy was curled against her side, his face peaceful for the first time since Jack had found them. Jack settled into his chair with a cup of coffee, watching the fire dance in the grate. Tomorrow, he would help them get to town, see them on their way to wherever they were going. And then his life would return to its familiar rhythm of solitude and routine. But as he sat there in the quiet cabin, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft breathing of his guests, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The careful isolation he'd built around himself felt different now, less like protection and more like a prison. He pushed the thought away and focused on the fire, on the simple pleasure of warmth and shelter on a cold night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he would face them as he always had alone, and on his own terms. But tonight, for the first time in years, Jack Rayner was not alone. And despite himself, he found that he didn't mind the company. Jack woke before dawn, as was his habit. The storm had passed some time in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Through his window, he could see the pristine white landscape stretching toward the mountains, unmarked except for the tracks of small animals seeking shelter. His guests were still sleeping by the fire, Clara's arms still protective around her son. In the gray light of morning, Jack could see more clearly the exhaustion that marked both their faces. Whatever they were running from had driven them hard. He moved quietly to the stove and began preparing breakfast, the familiar routine of coffee and bacon helping to settle his thoughts. As the aroma filled the cabin, Clara stirred, her eyes opening slowly before focusing on him with startled awareness. "Good morning," Jack said softly, not wanting to wake the boy. "Coffee's almost ready." Clara sat up carefully, smoothing her hair back from her face. In the morning light, Jack noticed details he'd missed the night before. Her dress, though travel-stained, was made of fine wool with careful stitching. Her boots were leather, well made, but not the kind a woman would choose for hard traveling. And when she moved, there was a delicate grace to her gestures that spoke of careful upbringing. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "I don't know what would have happened to us if you hadn't found us." "The storm's passed," Jack replied, settling into his chair with his own cup. "I can take you to town this morning if you'd like. Clearwater's got a hotel, and there's a stage that runs to Cheyenne twice a week." Something flickered across Clara's face relief, perhaps, but also something that looked like fear. "That's very generous, but—" She paused, glancing down at her son, who was beginning to stir. Would it be possible to wait another day? Tommy's been through so much, and the traveling has been hard on him. Jack studied her face, noting the carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes. "Of course," he said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Tommy sat up then, his dark eyes immediately finding Jack's face. The boy still hadn't spoken, but Jack could see intelligence there, and a wariness that seemed far too old for his years. "Good morning, son," Jack said gently. "Are you hungry?" The boy looked to his mother, who nodded encouragingly. Tommy gave a small nod in return. His first real communication since arriving got, as they ate breakfast, Jack found himself studying his guests more closely. Clara ate with the careful manners of someone raised in polite society, but her hands told a different story. They were softer than those of most frontier women, with only recent calluses suggesting unaccustomed work. And when she thought he wasn't looking, she had a habit of touching a ring on her left hand, not a simple wedding band, but something more elaborate, though she kept it turned inward so the stone didn't show Tommy. Meanwhile, continued his silent observation. Jack noticed that despite his youth, the boy seemed to catalog every detail of the cabin, his eyes lingering on the rifle over the fireplace and the heavy bar that secured the door. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned to assess threats and escape routes knowledge no child should need. "Tell me about yourselves," Jack said as he refilled Clara's coffee. "You mentioned you were traveling to California?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her ring, a gesture so quick he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. "Yes," she said. "My husband passed away recently, and I thought a fresh start might be good for both of us." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jack said, and meant it. He'd known his share of grief, and he could see it in the careful way she held herself, the shadows around her eyes. "Thank you." Clara's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "It's been difficult, but we're managing." Jack nodded, understanding the need to maintain dignity in the face of loss. But there were still questions that nagged at him. A widow with means, and Clara clearly had some means, despite her current circumstances, wouldn't typically be traveling alone with a child in winter. And the boy's silence suggested trauma beyond normal grief. As if sensing his thoughts, Clara straightened in her chair. "Mr. Rayner, I hope you won't think me forward, but I have to ask, do you live here completely alone?" "I do," Jack replied. "Have for 10 years now." "Don't you get lonely?" Jack considered the question. "Lonely and alone aren't the same thing," he said finally. "I've found that being alone suits me better than being around people who don't understand what I've been through." Clara nodded slowly. "The war?" "Among other things." Jack didn't elaborate, but something in his tone seemed to satisfy her. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the pines. Jack found himself watching Tommy, who had finished eating and was now studying a carved wooden horse that sat on the mantelpiece apiece. Jack had whittled during a particularly long winter evening. The boy's attention to the horse was different from his previous wariness. His eyes had softened, and for a moment He looked like what he was, a child drawn to a simple toy. Jack got up and retrieved the horse, offering it to Tommy. "You can play with it if you'd like," he said. Tommy looked to his mother again, and at her encouraging nod, he took the horse carefully in his small hands. Jack noticed immediately that the boy handled it with the familiarity of someone accustomed to well-made toys. His fingers traced the careful detail of the carving with appreciation, and he held it with the confident grip of a child who'd owned many such things. "It's beautiful work," Clara said, watching her son. "Did you make it yourself?" "Winter project," Jack replied. "Keeps the hands busy when there's not much else to do." But as he watched Tommy examine the horse, Jack's attention was drawn to something else entirely. The boy was wearing what appeared to be a simple cotton shirt, but the stitching was too fine, too precise for common clothing. And when Tommy shifted position, Jack caught a glimpse of embroidered initials on the shirt collar knot, "To you," as he might have expected for Tommy Whitmore, but something else. The letters were partially hidden, but they definitely didn't match the name Clara had given. Jack filed the observation away without comment, but it added to his growing sense that his guests were not what they seemed. Clara had said they were traveling to California for a fresh start, but everything about them suggested they were running from something specific and something dangerous. As the morning wore on, Clara began to relax slightly. She helped Jack with small tasks around the cabin, and he noticed that while she was unfamiliar with some basic household work, she had an innate grace and intelligence that allowed her to adapt quickly. When she swept the floor, her movements were careful and thorough. When she helped prepare the noon meal, she followed his instructions precisely, though it was clear she was more accustomed to giving orders than taking them. It was while they were working together that she let slip her first real clue about her past. "I used to have someone who did this sort of work," she said, then immediately looked stricken, as if she'd revealed too much. "Most folks do, one way or another," Jack said easily, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. "Family, servants, neighbors, we all need help sometimes." But the word servants had clearly hit close to home. Clara's face went pale, and she glanced quickly at Tommy, who was still playing quietly with the wooden horse. "Yes," she said quietly. "Family." Jack sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he continued working, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. He'd learned long ago that people revealed more when they weren't being questioned directly. It was Tommy who provided the next piece of the puzzle. The boy had been playing with the horse, making soft sounds that weren't quite words, but suggested the normal play of a child. But when a gust of wind rattled the windows, he suddenly froze, his entire body going rigid with fear. "Mama," he whispered, the first word Jack had heard him speak, and his voice was filled with terror. Clara was at his side instantly, gathering him into her arms. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. "It's just the wind. We're safe here." But Tommy was shaking now, his eyes fixed on the window as if he expected to see something terrible there. "They can't find us, can they, Mama?" he whispered. "They can't find us here?" Clara's face went white, and her eyes darted to Jack before returning to her son. "No, darling," she said, but her voice was strained. "They can't find us. We're safe." Jack felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Whatever Clara and Tommy were running from, it wasn't just grief or a desire for a fresh start. They were hiding from someone who had frightened a child badly enough to steal his voice and fill him with terror at the sound of wind. "Who's looking for you?" Jack asked quietly. Clara's arms tightened around Tommy, and for a moment, Jack thought she might finally tell him the truth. But then her face closed off, resuming the careful mask she'd worn since arriving. "No one," she said. "Tommy's just... he's been having nightmares since his father died. Sometimes he gets confused." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Jack could see the fear in her eyes now, the desperation of a woman who was trying to protect her child from something she couldn't control. "Clara," he said gently, "if someone's after you, I need to know. This is my home, and I have a right to know what kind of danger you might be bringing to my door." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the war being fought behind her green eyes. The need for honesty battled with years of caution. Trust warred with fear. "There are people," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. People who want to take Tommy away from me. They have money, influence. I couldn't fight them through legal means, so I... She trailed off, unable to finish. So you ran, Jack said. Clara nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I couldn't let them have him. He's all I have left of ... She stopped, shaking her head. I'm sorry. I should have told you. If you want us to leave. I didn't say that, Jack interrupted. But I need to know what we're dealing with. How far behind you are they? Do they know you're in this area? I don't know, Clara admitted. We've been traveling for 3 weeks, trying to stay ahead of them. But they have resources I don't. Men who know how to track, how to find people who don't want to be found. Jack absorbed this information, his military mind automatically beginning to assess the tactical situation. If Clara was telling the truth, and there were people with resources actively hunting for her and Tommy, then his isolated homestead could either be the perfect hiding place or a trap with no escape route. These people who are after you, he said, are they the law? Clara shook her head quickly. No, they claim legal authority, but what they're doing, it's not right. They're not good people, Mr. Rayner. If they find us ... She looked down at Tommy, who had gone quiet again, pressing his face against her shoulder. Jack made his decision. Then they won't find you, he said simply. Clara looked up at him in surprise. What? You're under my roof now, Jack said. That means you're under my protection. If these people want to get to you and the boy, they'll have to go through me. First, you don't understand, Clara said urgently. These aren't just ordinary men. They have power, influence. They won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. Jack's smile was grim, and for a moment, Clara caught a glimpse of the soldier he'd once been. Lady, he said quietly, they're welcome to try. For the first time since arriving, Clara's careful composure cracked, and tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for strangers? Jack looked at Tommy, who was watching him with those 2 old eyes, and thought about the choices that had led him to this isolated valley. He thought about the metal hidden in his chest, the lives he'd taken and saved, the long years of solitude he'd imposed on himself. Because, he said finally, sometimes running away isn't enough. Sometimes you have to make a stand. As if in response to his words, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The desperate fear that had clung to Clara and Tommy since their arrival was beginning to give way to something else. Hope. Perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. Jack Rayner had spent 10 years building walls around his life, keeping the world and its complications at bay. But now, faced with a woman and child who needed protection more than they needed answers, he found those walls beginning to crumble. The storm outside had passed, but Jack sensed that a different kind of storm was coming, one that would test everything he'd learned about himself in the years since the war. And for the first time in a decade, he found himself looking forward to the fight. 3 days passed before Clara mentioned leaving again, and by then, a routine had settled over the small cabin that felt almost natural. Jack woke each morning to find coffee already brewing and Clara quietly preparing breakfast, moving around his kitchen with increasing familiarity. Tommy had claimed a corner near the fireplace where he played with the wooden horse, occasionally making soft sounds that weren't quite words, but suggested the gradual return of a child's natural impulses. Boy's silence remained, but it had become less rigid, less fearful. When Jack moved around the cabin, Tommy's eyes followed him with curiosity rather than wariness. And twice now, Jack had caught the hint of a smile when he demonstrated some small task or shared an observation about the weather or the animals. This particular morning, Jack was preparing to check his cattle when he noticed Tommy watching him with unusual intensity. The boy had abandoned his wooden horse and was standing near the window, his small hands pressed against the glass as he observed Jack's preparations. Want to come along? Jack asked, surprising himself with the offer. Tommy looked immediately to his mother, who was kneading dough for the day's bread. Clara paused in her work, flour dusting her hands as she considered the request. I don't know, she said carefully. He's not used to being around animals. But Tommy was already moving toward the door, his eyes bright with interest for the first. time since arriving. Jack saw the boy's eagerness and made his decision. "We'll start small," he said. "Just a walk to the barn. If he gets uncomfortable, we'll come right back." Clara nodded reluctantly, and Jack helped Tommy into his coat, another piece of clothing that spoke of quality and expense, despite its current worn condition. As they stepped outside together, Jack noticed how Tommy automatically stayed close to his side, not with fear, but with the natural trust of a child who had decided that this particular adult was safe. The morning was crisp and clear, the snow crunching under their boots as they made their way to the barn. Jack's cattle were clustered near the building, their breath steaming in the cold air as they waited for their morning feed. When Tommy saw them, he stopped abruptly, his eyes wide. "They're bigger than I thought," he whispered, only the third complete sentence Jack had heard from him. "They look bigger than they are because of their winter coats," Jack explained, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Would you like to help me feed them?" Tommy nodded eagerly, and Jack showed him how to measure out the feed, how to distribute. It's so each animal got their fair share. The boy was a quick learner, his movements careful and precise. When one of the younger steers approached the fence, Tommy held out his hand tentatively, and Jack guided him through the proper way to let the animal take feed from his palm. "He's gentle," Tommy observed, his voice full of wonder as the steer's soft nose brushed against his hand. "Most of them are," Jack agreed. "They know we take care of them, so they trust us." Something in Tommy's expression shifted at those words, and Jack realized the boy was learning more than just how to handle cattle. He was learning about trust itself, how it was earned, how it was maintained, how it could exist between different kinds of beings. When they returned to the cabin, Tommy was chattering softly about the animals, describing what he'd seen to his mother with an animation Jack hadn't witnessed before. Clara listened with tears in her eyes, and when she looked at Jack, her gratitude was unmistakable. "Thank you," she said simply. That afternoon, while Tommy napped by the fire, Clara and Jack worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by the storm. It was during this quiet work that Clara began to reveal more of herself. "I never did work like this before," she said, struggling with the wire cutters Jack had given her. "My husband always said it wasn't appropriate for a lady." "What did your husband do?" Jack asked, showing her how to grip the tool more effectively. "Railroad," Clara replied, then immediately looked as if she wished she hadn't spoken. Jack nodded, as if the information meant nothing to him, but privately he filed it away with his other observations. Railroad money would explain Clara's refined manners and expensive clothes. It would also explain why someone might be pursuing her. Railroad fortunes were substantial, and there were always people willing to fight over them. "Must have been hard work," he said neutrally. "He wasn't the one doing the physical labor," Clara said with a slight edge to her voice. "He owned. He managed several lines in the East." The correction was telling. Clara had started to say her husband owned the railroad lines, then caught herself. Jack suspected that whatever her husband had owned was now the subject of dispute, and that Tommy, as the heir, was at the center of that dispute. "Children and money," Jack observed quietly. "They complicate things." Clara's hands stilled on. "The fence wire." "Yes," she said. "They do." They worked in comfortable silence after that, but Jack could sense Clara's internal struggle. She wanted to trust him. He could see it in the way she relaxed when they were working together, in the grateful look she gave him when he was patient with Tommy. But trust was dangerous for someone in her position, and she was caught between her natural inclination toward honesty and the necessity of protecting her son. That evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Tommy surprised them both by producing a small leather journal from his coat pocket. The book was bound in fine leather with gilt edges, clearly expensive and well made. He opened it carefully and began to sketch, his small fingers surprisingly skilled with the pencil dot. Jack watched, fascinated, as a detailed drawing of the morning's cattle feeding took shape on the page. Tommy had captured not just the animals themselves, but the texture of their winter coats, the way the steam rose from their breath, even the expression of gentle curiosity in the young steer's eyes. "That's remarkable," Jack said honestly. "Where did you learn to draw like that?" Tommy looked up from his work, suddenly shy again. He glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I had a teacher," Tommy said quietly. "Mr. Pemberton," he said. I had a natural eye. He was right, Jack said, studying the sketch more closely. The level of detail and observation was extraordinary for a child, but it also spoke of expensive education and careful instruction. Clara was watching, her son with a mixture of pride and sadness. Tommy always loved to draw, she said. He would sketch everything: the house, the gardens, the horses. She trailed off, realizing she was revealing too much about their former life. But Jack pretended not to notice the slip. Instead, he focused on Tommy's obvious talent and enthusiasm. Would you like to draw some of the other animals tomorrow? He asked. I've got a Mare who's very patient with visitors. Tommy's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. For the rest of the evening, he continued sketching, capturing details of the cabin's interior with the same careful attention he'd given to the cattle. Jack found himself genuinely impressed by the boy's skill and began to understand another dimension of what Clara was fighting to protect. Tommy wasn't just heir to whatever fortune his father had left behind. He was a child with genuine gifts, with potential that could be nurtured or destroyed, depending on who controlled his upbringing. No wonder Clara was willing to risk everything to keep him away from people who saw him only as a means to an end. As the evening wore on, Jack began to see his guests not as temporary visitors, but as people who might become part of his life in a more permanent way. The thought should have disturbed him. He'd spent 10 years building his solitude, convincing himself that isolation was safety. But instead, he found himself imagining what it might be like to have Clara's quiet presence in his kitchen each morning, to watch Tommy grow and develop his artistic talents, to be part of something larger than his own carefully controlled existence. It was a dangerous line of thinking for a man who'd learned that caring for others only led to loss. But as he watched Clara help Tommy close his journal and prepare for bed, Jack found himself wondering if perhaps the risk might be worth it. Later, after his guests were settled for the night, Jack stepped outside to check on his animals one final time. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, he could hear the soft sounds of his cattle settling in for the night, and closer, the gentle whisper of wind through the pines. It was the same scene he'd observed countless times over the past 10 years, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, his cabin held more than just himself and his memories. Tonight, there were other people depending on him, trusting him to keep them safe. The responsibility should have felt burdensome, but instead, it felt like a gift, a chance to be useful in a way that mattered, to protect something precious rather than simply enduring another day in isolation. As he turned to go back inside, Jack caught a glimpse of movement in the trees at the edge of his property. He froze, his hand automatically moving to the rifle he'd brought outside. For a long moment, he stared into the darkness, every sense alert, but the movement wasn't repeated, and after several minutes of careful observation, Jack decided it had probably been a deer or elk moving through the forest. Still, the incident reminded him that Clara's fears weren't unreasonable. If people were truly hunting for her and Tommy, his isolated homestead might not remain safe forever. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin taking precautions. He would start thinking like the soldier he'd once been, planning for threats that might come from multiple directions. Because whatever else happened, he wasn't going to let anyone take Clara and Tommy away from the safety they'd found here. As he settled into his chair by the fire, listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping guests, Jack Raynor began to plan for war. The following morning brought a warmth that hadn't been felt since Clara and Tommy's arrival. Jack woke to the sound of quiet laughter, Tommy's laughter drifting from the kitchen area. He found the boy helping his mother prepare breakfast, standing on a wooden crate to reach the counter, his small hands carefully cracking eggs into a bowl under Clara's patient guidance. "Good morning," Clara said, her face brighter than Jack had seen it since their first night. "Tommy wanted to help make breakfast for you." The boy beamed up at Jack with pride, a streak of flour across his cheek. "Mama's teaching me to make real pancakes," he announced, his voice stronger and more confident than it had been in days. Jack felt something shift in his chest at the sight, warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "Well then, I'd better make sure I'm properly hungry for them," he said solemnly, which earned him another giggle from Tommy as they ate breakfast together. Jack noticed how naturally the three of them had fallen into the rhythms of a family. Clara had claimed the responsibility of managing the household tasks, though she still moved with the careful attention of someone learning skills that should have been second nature. Tommy had appointed himself Jack's assistant in all outdoor work, following him with eager questions and careful observations. It was during their morning chores that Jack began to piece together more of Clara's story. She was hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between two posts, and he noticed the careful way she handled each garment, as if she were still learning the proper technique. "I had to dismiss our staff 3 weeks before we left," she said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "It wasn't fair to them, but I couldn't risk them being questioned about our whereabouts." Jack continued mending the bridle in his hands, giving Clara space to reveal what she chose to share. "Must have been hard, leaving people who worked for you. They weren't just staff," Clara said quietly. "Some of them had been with my husband's family for years. Mrs. Patterson, our housekeeper, had known Tommy since he was born. When I told her we were leaving," she stopped, her hands stilling on the wet fabric. "She understood?" Clara nodded, tears threatening. "She packed our clothes herself, included things I never would have thought to bring, and she gave me this." Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather journal, similar to the one Tommy used for sketching, but smaller, more personal. She said every woman needed a place to record her thoughts, especially during difficult times. "I've been trying to write in it, but—" Clara laughed shakily. "I'm not sure what to say. My old life feels like it belonged to someone else entirely." Jack studied her face, noting the way she spoke of her past in definite terms, as if it were truly finished. "What kind of life was it?" he asked gently. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the mountains in the distance. "Comfortable," she said finally. "Predictable. I knew exactly what was expected of me each day, which social calls to make, which charities to support, how to manage a household staff, how to entertain my husband's business associates." She paused, a bitter smile crossing her face. "I was very good at it, actually. The perfect railroad wife. But I was never me. I was Mrs. Robert Whitmore, hostess and ornament. I had opinions, but I wasn't supposed to voice them. I had interests, but they had to be appropriate for a lady of my station. And Tommy—" Her voice softened as she glanced toward where her son was carefully feeding the chickens Jack kept behind the cabin. "Tommy was being groomed to take over his father's empire someday, whether he wanted to or not." Jack absorbed this information, understanding now why Clara had been willing to give up everything to protect her son's freedom. What did Tommy want? "To draw," Clara said simply. "To ride horses. To climb trees and get dirty and ask endless questions about how things work. He wanted to be a little boy, not a future railroad magnate. And now?" Clara smiled, watching her son's animated conversation with the chickens. "Now he's remembering how to be a child again. He talks to me now, really talks. He asks questions. He laughs." Her expression grew serious. "That's worth any sacrifice, Mr. Rayner. That's worth running from everything I've ever known." Jack understood the fierce protectiveness in her voice. He'd seen it in the war parents who would do anything to shield their children from harm. But he also heard something else. The loneliness of a woman who had discovered her own strength only to find herself completely alone in the world. "What about what you want?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise Clara. She looked at him with startled eyes, as if no one had asked her that in years, which, Jack realized, might well be the case. "I double quotes," she began, then stopped. "I want Tommy to be safe. I want him to grow up free to make his own choices." "That's what you want for Tommy," Jack said patiently. "What do you want for yourself?" Clara stared at him for a long moment, and Jack could see her wrestling with the unfamiliar concept of her own desires, as separate from her duties as a mother and widow. "I want to learn things," she said finally, her voice almost wondering. "I want to understand how to make bread that rises properly, and how to tell when the weather's going to change, and—" She looked around the homestead, taking in the mountains and the wide sky. "I want to wake up each morning without fear. I want to go to sleep each night knowing that tomorrow will be what we make it, not what someone else demands it to be." Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. "Freedom," he said, double quotes, "yes." Clara's voice was firm now, confident. "Freedom." They worked together in comfortable silence after that, but Jack found his thoughts turning increasingly to the future. Clara had spoken of her old life as finished, but what kind of new life was she imagining? Did it include him? Or was he simply a way station on her journey to somewhere else? The question became more pressing as the days passed and Clara began to settle into life at the homestead with increasing ease. She had a natural intelligence that allowed her to master new skills quickly, and she brought an organizational efficiency to the household that impressed Jack despite himself. More than that, she seemed genuinely happy with the simple work and the quiet rhythms of frontier life. Tommy, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that were obvious to anyone who observed him. His journal filled with sketches of animals, landscapes, and daily life at the homestead. His voice grew stronger each day, and his questions became more complex and thoughtful. Jack found himself looking forward to the boy's eager companionship, to the fresh perspective he brought to familiar tasks. It was while they were working together to repair a section of the barn roof that Tommy asked the question Jack had been dreading. "Are we going to stay here forever?" The boy asked, his small hands steady as he held a board in place for Jack to nail. Jack glanced toward the cabin, where Clara was hanging freshly washed curtains in the windows. "That's something you'd need to discuss with your mother," he said, carefully. "But would you want us to stay?" Tommy pressed. "If Mama said yes, would you want us to?" Jack paused in his hammering, struck by the directness of the question and the hope in Tommy's voice. The boy had found security here, had begun to heal from whatever trauma had stolen his voice. Of course he would want to stay. "Yes," Jack said honestly, "I'd want you to stay." Tommy smiled, a brilliant, uncomplicated expression of joy. "Good," he said, "because I like it here. I like taking care of the animals with you. And Mama smiles more than she used to." That evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Clara surprised Jack by bringing up the subject herself. "Tommy tells me he'd like to stay here permanently," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Jack looked up from the harness he was mending. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't entirely our decision to make." Clara's eyes met his across the firelight. "This is your home, Mr. Rayner. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You haven't imposed," Jack said quietly. "You've made this place better, more alive." Clara studied his face in the flickering light. "You mean that?" "I do." Jack set aside his work and leaned forward. "Clara, I've lived alone for 10 years. I chose that life because I thought it was safer, simpler. But having you and Tommy here has reminded me of things I'd forgotten. What it feels like to have a purpose beyond just surviving another day. What it means to have people to care for and protect." "We can't pay you," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have some jewelry I could sell, but I don't want your money," Jack interrupted. "I want ... He stopped, suddenly uncertain how to express what he'd been feeling. "What do you want?" Clara asked, echoing the question he'd posed to her days before. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the way the firelight caught the gold in her brown hair, the strength in her face that had emerged as her fear receded, the grace with which she'd adapted to this rough frontier life. "I want you to stay," he said simply, "both of you, for as long as you're willing." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, Jack thought she might refuse. But then her face softened, and she smiled, the same genuine smile that had transformed her features that first night. "I think," she said quietly, "that we'd like that very much." From his corner by the fire, Tommy looked up from his sketching with satisfaction, as if this outcome had been obvious all along, and perhaps it had been, Jack reflected. Perhaps from the moment he'd found them in the storm, this had been inevitable. Lonely Cowboy, the refugee widow, and the silent boy who'd brought them together. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow dancing past the glass. But inside the cabin, 3 people who had been strangers a week ago settled into their new reality as a chosen family, bound together by necessity, but sustained by something deeper. For the first time in 10 years, Jack Rayner was no longer alone. And for the first time in months, Clara and Tommy Whitmore were no longer afraid. It felt like the beginning of something worth protecting. 2 weeks into their new arrangement, Jack rode into Clearwater for supplies. It was his first trip to town since Clara and Tommy's arrival, and he'd delayed it as long as possible, reluctant to leave them alone on the homestead. But they were running low on essentials, and winter in Wyoming demanded careful preparation. Clara had pressed a carefully written list into his hand before he left, along with specific instructions about which fabrics to choose for new clothes. For Tommy and herself, her handwriting was elegant and precise, another small reminder of the education and refinement she'd left behind. "Are you certain you'll be all right?" Jack had asked for the third time as he saddled his horse. "We'll be fine," Clara assured him, though he noticed she kept glancing toward the tree line as she spoke. "Tommy and I will stay close to the cabin, and I have the rifle you showed me how to use." Jack had spent considerable time teaching Clara to handle the Winchester, and she'd proven to be a surprisingly good shot. Still, leaving them felt wrong somehow, as if he were abandoning his post in the face of an unseen enemy. Clearwater was a small town, barely more than a main street lined, with wooden storefronts and a few side streets that petered out into the prairie. Jack knew most of the residents by sight, if not by name, and he'd always appreciated the way they respected his privacy, asking no questions about his solitary life or his reasons for choosing isolation. But today felt different. As he tied his horse outside Morrison's general store, Jack caught sight of two strangers lingering near the hotel. They were well-dressed men with the soft look of city dwellers, and there was something about the way they watched the street that made Jack's soldier instincts prickle with unease. Inside the store, Morrison greeted him with his usual friendly nod. "Jack, haven't seen you in a while. How's that homestead of yours holding up?" "Well enough," Jack replied, producing Clara's list. "Need to stock up for the rest of winter." As Morrison gathered the requested items, Jack found himself listening to the conversations around him. Two women were discussing the strangers at the hotel, their voices carrying the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that greeted any outsider. "In a small town, they're asking questions about a woman and a boy," one of them was saying, "claiming they're family members who've gone missing." Jack's blood chilled, but he kept his expression neutral as he continued examining the bolts of fabric Clara had requested. "What kind of questions?" the other woman asked. "Oh, you know, have we seen a lady traveling with a young son, probably on foot or in a wagon? They showed me a photograph, actually. Pretty woman, though she looked unhappy. The boy was maybe 8 or 9, dark hair like his mother." Jack forced himself to breathe normally as he selected a sturdy blue cotton that would serve for work dresses for Clara. The description could fit dozens of women, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. "Did you recognize them?" "The people in the photograph? No, can't say I did. But then, we don't get many travelers through here in winter. If someone like that had come through town, we'd have noticed." Jack paid for his supplies, making conversation with Morrison about the weather and the condition of the mountain passes. But his mind was racing, calculating distances and timing. If these men were indeed looking for Clara and Tommy, how long before they expanded their search to include the isolated homesteads scattered throughout the valley? As he loaded his purchases into his saddlebags, Jack noticed one of the strangers approaching him. The man was in his 40s, with thinning hair and pale eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Jack's appearance. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm rather than force. "I wonder if you might help me. I'm looking for my sister-in-law and her son. They've been missing for several weeks, and we're quite worried about them." Jack met the man's gaze steadily. "This is rough country to be traveling alone," he said. "What makes you think they came this way?" "We've been following their trail for some time," the man replied, producing a small photograph from his coat pocket. "Perhaps you've seen them?" Jack glanced at the photograph, his heart sinking even as his face remained impassive. It was clearly Clara and Tommy, though the picture had been taken in happier times. Clara was wearing an elaborate dress and was seated in what appeared to be a well-appointed parlor, with Tommy standing beside her chair. Both were smiling, but there was a stiffness to their poses that suggested formal portraiture rather than casual family photographs. "Can't say I have," Jack said, handing the photograph back. "But like I said, this isn't country where a woman and child would survive long on their own, especially in winter." Something flickered in the stranger's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, or suspicion. "Yes, that's what we're afraid of. I'm Thomas Whitmore, by the way," The woman is my brother's widow." Jack absorbed the name, noting that the man claimed to be Tommy's uncle. But there was something about his manner that didn't suggest familial concern so much as proprietary interest. "Jack Rayner," he replied, offering his hand. "I run a small, spread about 15 miles northeast of here. Isolated area?" Thomas asked, his interest sharpening slightly. "Very," Jack confirmed. "Don't see another soul for weeks at a time, especially in winter." Thomas nodded, but Jack could see him filing away the information. "Well, if you do happen to see anything, I'd appreciate you letting me know. We're staying at the hotel for a few more days." "Of course," Jack said. "Hope you find them safe." As he rode out of town, Jack's mind was already working through the implications of the encounter. Thomas Whitmore had the look of a man with resources and determination. The fact that he was conducting a methodical search, rather than relying on local law enforcement, suggested that whatever claim he had on Clara and Tommy might not withstand legal scrutiny, or that he preferred to handle family matters privately. Either way, Jack's isolated homestead was no longer the sanctuary it had seemed. If Thomas and his companion were thorough in their search, it would only be a matter of time before they investigated every homestead in the valley. The ride home seemed longer than usual, and Jack found himself constantly checking his back trail and scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of pursuit. By the time he reached his property, the sun was setting, and he could see the warm glow of lamplight in his cabin windows. Ali, sight that had become more precious to him than he'd realized. Clara met him at the door, her relief evident. "How did it go? Did you get everything on the list?" "Most of it," Jack said, beginning to unload his supplies. But as he worked, he found himself studying Clara's face, comparing it to the formal portrait Thomas Whitmore had shown him. In the photograph, she had looked like exactly what she'd claimed to be a wealthy man's wife, carefully dressed and positioned to reflect her husband's status. But the woman before him now, with her practical clothes and work-roughened hands, seemed like an entirely different person. "Jack?" Clara's voice held a note of concern. "Is something wrong?" He made his decision. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing toward Tommy, who was absorbed in sketching by the fire. There were men in town asking questions. Clara went very still, her face losing all color. "What kind of men?" "The kind with photographs of you and Tommy. The kind who claimed to be family." Clara sank into a chair, as if her legs had given out. "Thomas," she whispered. "It has to be Thomas. I knew he wouldn't give up, but I'd hoped." She looked up at Jack with desperate eyes. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say," Jack replied, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "They're being methodical, checking every possibility. But this valley has dozens of homesteads, and most of them are snowed in for the winter. Could be days, could be weeks before they work their way out here. We have to leave," Clara said, starting to rise. "Tonight. If they find us here, they'll—" "No," Jack interrupted, his tone firm. "Running in winter, in the dark, with a child? That's suicide, Clara. And where would you go? They have resources, connections. They'll find you eventually." "Then what do you suggest?" Clara's voice was strained, edged with the fear that had been her constant companion for so many weeks. Jack looked at her, then at Tommy, who had stopped sketching and was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. The boy had just begun to feel safe, to trust that this place could be home. Jack wasn't about to let that security be destroyed without a fight. "We make our stand here," he said simply. "This is defensible ground, and I know every inch of it. More importantly, this is our home now. Sometimes running just means dying tired." Clara stared at him. "Jack, you don't understand what these people are capable of. Thomas has money, influence. He can make people disappear, arrange accidents. He's not going to simply accept defeat. Then he'll learn that some things are worth fighting for," Jack replied. "Clara, I've been a soldier. I've faced men who thought their power made them untouchable. Money and influence don't stop bullets, and they don't survive in country like this without local knowledge and experience." Jack absorbed the name, noting that the man claimed to be Tommy's uncle. But there was something about his manner that didn't suggest familial concern so much as proprietary interest. "Jack Rayner," he replied, offering his hand. I run a small, spread about 15 miles northeast of here. Isolated area? Thomas asked, his interest sharpening slightly. Very, Jack confirmed. Don't see another soul for weeks at a time, especially in winter. Thomas nodded, but Jack could see him filing away the information. Well, if you do happen to see anything, I'd appreciate you letting me know. We're staying at the hotel for a few more days. Of course, Jack said. Hope you find them safe. As he rode out of town, Jack's mind was already working through the implications of the encounter. Thomas Whitmore had the look of a man with resources and determination. The fact that he was conducting a methodical search, rather than relying on local law enforcement, suggested that whatever claim he had on Clara and Tommy might not withstand legal scrutiny, or that he preferred to handle family matters privately. Either way, Jack's isolated homestead was no longer the sanctuary it had seemed. If Thomas and his companion were thorough in their search, it would only be a matter of time before they investigated every homestead in the valley. The ride home seemed longer than usual, and Jack found himself constantly checking his back trail and scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of pursuit. By the time he reached his property, the sun was setting, and he could see the warm glow of lamplight in his cabin windows. The sight that had become more precious to him than he'd realized. Clara met him at the door, her relief evident. How did it go? Did you get everything on the list? Most of it, Jack said, beginning to unload his supplies. But as he worked, he found himself studying Clara's face, comparing it to the formal portrait Thomas Whitmore had shown him. In the photograph, she had looked like exactly what she'd claimed to be a wealthy man's wife, carefully dressed and positioned to reflect her husband's status. But the woman before him now, with her practical clothes and work-roughened hands, seemed like an entirely different person. Jack? Clara's voice held a note of concern. Is something wrong? He made his decision. We need to talk, he said quietly, glancing toward Tommy, who was absorbed in sketching by the fire. There were men in town asking questions. Clara went very still, her face losing all color. What kind of men? The kind with photographs of you and Tommy, the kind who claimed to be family. Clara sank into a chair, as if her legs had given out. Thomas, she whispered. It has to be Thomas. I knew he wouldn't give up, but I'd hoped. She looked up at Jack with desperate eyes. How long do we have? Hard to say, Jack replied, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. They're being methodical, checking every possibility. But this valley has dozens of homesteads, and most of them are snowed in for the winter. Could be days, could be weeks before they work their way out here. We have to leave, Clara said, starting to rise. Tonight. If they find us here, they'll... No, Jack interrupted, his tone firm. Running in winter, in the dark, with a child? That's suicide, Clara. And where would you go? They have resources, connections. They'll find you eventually. Then what do you suggest? Clara's voice was strained, edged with the fear that had been her constant companion for so many weeks. Jack looked at her, then at Tommy, who had stopped sketching and was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. The boy had just begun to feel safe, to trust that this place could be home. Jack wasn't about to let that security be destroyed without a fight. We make our stand here, he said simply. This is defensible ground, and I know every inch of it. More importantly, this is our home now. Sometimes running just means dying tired. Clara stared at him. Jack, you don't understand what these people are capable of. Thomas has money, influence. He can make people disappear, arrange accidents. He's not going to simply accept defeat. Then, he'll learn that some things are worth fighting for. Jack replied. Clara, I've been a soldier. I've faced men who thought their power made them untouchable. Money and influence don't stop bullets, and they don't survive in country like this, without local knowledge and experience. The next morning brought visitors, not the dangerous kind Jack had been expecting, but Mrs. Henley and her teenage son David from the neighboring ranch, riding up through the snow with obvious purpose. Jack watched them approach from his position. By the window, noting their relaxed posture and the fact that they'd made no attempt at stealth. Riders coming, he called softly to Clara, who was preparing breakfast with Tommy's help. Neighbors, not trouble. But Clara immediately moved away from the windows, positioning herself where she couldn't be easily seen from outside. Tommy, picking up on his mother's tension, abandoned his morning chores and moved to stand behind Jack's chair. Mrs. Henley was a sturdy woman in her 50s who'd been running her late husband's ranch for the better part of a decade. Jack respected her practical competence and her ability to mind her own business, which made her unexpected visit all the more concerning. "Morning, Jack," she called out as she dismounted. "Mind if we come in? Got something I think you should know about." Jack opened the door, noting the serious expression on her weathered face. "Course, Martha. Coffee's fresh." She stepped inside, followed by her son David, a lanky boy of 17, who worked his mother's ranch with the steady competence of someone raised to hard work. Both of them nodded politely to Clara and Tommy, but Jack could see their curiosity about his unexpected guests. "This is Mrs. Clara Whitmore and her son Tommy," Jack said simply. "They've been staying with me since the storm." Martha Henley's eyes were sharp and knowing, but she simply nodded. "Pleased to meet you both," she said. "Sorry to intrude so early, but I thought Jack should know. There were strangers at our place yesterday asking questions." Jack poured coffee for his visitors, his movements careful and controlled. "What kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman and a boy," David spoke up, his young voice serious. "Said they were family, gone missing." Showed us a photograph. Clara had gone very still behind Jack, and he could feel her fear like a physical presence in the room. "Thing is," Martha continued, accepting the coffee gratefully, "something about those men didn't sit right with me. They had the look of hired help, if you know what I mean. And when I told them I hadn't seen anyone matching their description, the older one got insistent." "Insistent how?" Jack asked. "Offered money for information," Martha replied, her tone disapproving. "Good money. The kind that makes a person wonder why family members would need to pay bounties to find their own relatives." David nodded earnestly. "And they weren't just asking about seeing them recently, Mr. Rayner. They wanted to know about isolated homesteads, places where someone might hole up for the winter. They asked specifically about your place." Jack felt Clara's sharp intake of breath behind him. "What did you tell them?" "Truth," Martha said firmly. "That you keep to yourself and don't welcome visitors." "But they seemed real interested in the fact that your place is isolated and defensible." She paused, studying Jack's face. "Jack, I've known you for years, and you've always been a private man. But if you've got people in trouble staying with, you and those men are hunting them." She let the sentence hang. Jack made a decision. Martha Henley had proven herself trustworthy over the years, and right now, Clara and Tommy needed all the allies they could get. "Clara," he said quietly, "why don't you tell Mrs. Henley what those men really want?" Clara stepped forward slowly, her posture straight despite her obvious fear. "They're not family," she said clearly. "Well, Thomas is my late husband's brother, but he's not here out of concern for our welfare. My husband owned several railroad lines, and when he died, everything was supposed to pass to Tommy. Thomas and his associates want control of that inheritance, and they're willing to—" She paused, glancing at her son. "They're willing to hurt us to get it," Tommy finished quietly, his young voice matter of fact. "They hurt Papa?" Martha's expression hardened. "I see," she said grimly. "And you came here to hide?" "We came here to escape," Clara corrected. "I thought if we could disappear long enough, find a place where Tommy could be safe." "Well, you picked the right man to help you," Martha said firmly, looking at Jack with approval. "But those men aren't going to give up easy, are they?" "No," Clara admitted. "They have too much to gain." Martha stood up, her decision clearly made. "David, ride over to the Johnsons' place and then the Castellis. Tell them we've got trouble coming through the valley, and they need to be prepared to deny seeing anything unusual. Make sure they understand these aren't lawmen or legitimate family members." "Yes, ma'am," David said, already moving toward the door. "Wait," Jack called out. "Tell them if anyone comes asking questions, they should mention that they heard someone." Matching that description was seen heading toward the southern pass last week. Give these men a false trail to follow. David nodded and hurried out. Martha turned back to Jack, her expression serious. "How bad is this likely to get?" she asked, bluntly. Jack glanced at Clara, who was holding Tommy close to her side. "Bad enough," he said. These men have money and no scruples. If they can't find Clara and Tommy through normal search methods, they'll try other approaches, such as intimidation, threats, maybe worse. Jack's voice was grim. Martha, you and David should stay clear of this. I appreciate the warning, but nonsense, Martha interrupted. Jack Rayner, you've been a good neighbor for 10 years. When that wildfire threatened my ranch 3 summers ago, you spent 2 days helping us dig fire breaks. When David broke his leg last winter, you rode through a blizzard to get the doctor. You think I'm going to abandon you now when you need help? Jack felt a warmth in his chest at her words, but also concern. This isn't a neighborly dispute. Martha, these people are dangerous. So are we, Martha replied firmly. This valley looks after its own, Jack. Always has. Over the next hour, Martha helped Jack plan the valley's response to the threat. They would coordinate information, ensure that anyone who came asking questions would be given false leads, and establish a warning system so that Jack would know if the searchers were getting close. There's something else, Martha said as she prepared to leave. Those men mentioned they had more people coming. Sounded like they're planning to expand their search significantly. How many more? Jack asked. Didn't say exactly, but the impression I got was that they're bringing in professional help. Trackers, maybe. People who know how to find folks who don't want to be found. After Martha and David left, Jack spent the rest of the morning making additional preparations. He showed Clara how to signal for help using a mirror to flash sunlight toward the Henley Ranch, and he established clear emergency procedures for different types of threats. Tommy, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the strategic aspects of their situation. He peppered Jack with questions about defensive positions, escape routes, and ways to confuse pursuers. His artistic eye proved useful in mapping the homestead's surroundings, and Jack found himself impressed by the boy's quick grasp of tactical concepts. You've got a natural head for this, Jack told him as they reviewed Tommy's carefully drawn map of the property. But I hope you never have to use these skills. I'm not scared, Tommy said, though his voice carried the false bravado of a child, trying to convince himself, you won't let them take me away. No, Jack agreed firmly. I won't. That afternoon, while Clara worked on strengthening the cabin's defenses by boarding up some of the lower windows, Jack made his way to a small cave hidden in the rocks about a quarter-mile from the homestead. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were items he'd hoped never to need again: his service revolver, extra ammunition, a spyglass, and other tools from his military days. But as he examined each item, checking their condition and functionality, Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. For 10 years, he'd run from the violence and duty that had defined his younger life. But now, faced with a threat to the people he'd come to love, he found himself grateful for every skill the Army had taught him. That evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Clara surprised him by producing a small bundle wrapped in silk. I need to show you something, she said, her voice hesitant. Something I haven't told you about what we're really running from. She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a collection of official-looking documents and what appeared to be stock certificates. The papers were ornate, printed on heavy stock with elaborate seals and signatures. My husband didn't just own railroad lines, Clara said quietly. He owned the controlling interest in the Transcontinental Railroad Company. When he died, everything was supposed to pass to Tommy, but only when he reaches the age of 21. Until then, the estate is supposed to be managed by a board of trustees. Jack studied the documents, beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. Let me guess, Thomas is one of the trustees. The senior trustee, Clara confirmed, along with 2 of my husband's former business partners. If something were to happen to Tommy ... She couldn't finish the sentence. They would control everything permanently, Jack concluded. Clara nodded. Billions of dollars, Jack. Control of transportation routes across half the country. The kind of power that shapes government policy and determines the fate of entire territories. Jack looked at Tommy, who was listening to the conversation with serious eyes. No wonder the boy had learned to be afraid. He wasn't just heir to money. He was heir to an empire that men would kill to control. There's more, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think my husband's death was natural. The doctor said it was his heart, but Robert was only 42 years old and in perfect health, and the night he died. She glanced at Tommy, who had gone very still. I saw Uncle Thomas there, Tommy said quietly, in Papa's study, after Papa fell down. Uncle Thomas was putting something in his pocket, and when he saw me, he looked ... The boy shuddered. He looked angry that I was there. Jack felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. They weren't just dealing with greedy relatives. They were dealing with murderers who had already killed once to gain control of the railroad fortune. Clara, he said gently, why didn't you go to the authorities? With what proof? Clara's voice was bitter. Thomas has influence everywhere that matters. The doctor who pronounced Robert dead is a family friend. The police chief in our city owes his position to railroad money, and Tommy was the only witness to anything suspicious. Who's going to believe the testimony of an 8-year-old boy? Against men with that kind of power? Jack understood now why Clara had chosen to run rather than fight. In her world of wealth and influence, the very systems meant to provide justice were compromised by money and political connections. But here, in the Wyoming Territory, different rules applied. They made a mistake coming here, Jack said quietly. This isn't their territory, and they're not dealing with people who can be bought or intimidated. You really think we can stop them? Clara asked. Jack looked at her, then at Tommy, seeing in both their faces the hope they were trying not to feel. I think, he said carefully, that men who are used to getting their way through money and manipulation don't do well when they have to face honest violence from people who have nothing left to lose. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, 3 people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances began to plan for the battle that would determine whether they could keep what they'd built together. Jack Rayner had spent 10 years hiding from his past as a soldier, but now, faced with the need to protect his chosen family, he was ready to remember everything the war had taught him about fighting and winning against overwhelming odds. The discovery came 3 days later, hidden among the papers Clara had been reluctant to show him. Jack was helping her organize the documents when he noticed a discrepancy in one of the legal certificates, a date that didn't align with Clara's account of her husband's death. Clara, he said carefully, holding up a document dated 2 weeks after Robert Whitmore's supposed death. This stock transfer is signed by your husband. Clara looked at the paper, her face growing pale. That's impossible, she whispered. Robert died on March 15th. This is dated March 30th. Jack studied the signature carefully. It appeared genuine, written in the same hand as other documents he'd seen. Could someone have forged it? The signature looks right, Clara said, her voice strained. But Robert was definitely dead by then. I saw his body, attended his funeral. She trailed off as Jack continued examining the papers. There were more inconsistencies. Business correspondence dated after the funeral. Financial transactions that required Robert's personal authorization. Either someone had become extraordinarily skilled at forgery, or... Clara, Jack said quietly, I think we need to consider another possibility. What do you mean? Jack spread the documents across the table, pointing to the various dates and signatures. What if your husband didn't die when you think he did? What if someone wanted you to believe he was dead? Clara stared at him, as if he'd suggested something impossible. Jack, I saw his body. The doctor examined him. We had a funeral. But, did you see him die? Jack pressed gently. Were you with him when it happened? Clara's face went white as she remembered. No, she whispered. I was upstairs putting Tommy to bed. When I came down, Thomas was already there with the doctor. They said Robert had collapsed in his study, that his heart had given out. She looked up at Jack with dawning horror. You think they ... You think they faked his death? Before Jack could answer, Tommy spoke up from his corner by the fire. Mama, he said in a small voice, I need to tell you something about that night. Clara went to him immediately, kneeling beside his chair. What is it, sweetheart? Tommy's hands were shaking as he set down his pencil. I wasn't just in Papa's study. After he fell down, I was there before, too. I was hiding behind the big chair because I wanted to show Papa my new drawing, but Uncle Thomas was there, talking to him about something important. What did you hear? Jack asked gently. Uncle Thomas was angry, Tommy said. He said Papa was being foolish, that he was going to ruin everything. And Papa said he was going to change his will, that he didn't trust Uncle Thomas anymore. Tommy looked up at his mother with frightened eyes. Then Uncle Thomas gave Papa something to drink, and Papa started feeling sick. Clara's breath caught. Tommy, why didn't you tell me this before? I tried to, Tommy said, tears starting to flow. But when I came out from behind the chair, Uncle Thomas saw me. He said if I ever told anyone what I saw, something bad would happen to you too. He said people would think I was lying because I was just a little boy, and then they would take me away from you forever. Jack felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. Clara, what happened to your husband's body after the funeral? It was ... Clara paused, thinking. Thomas handled all the arrangements. He said it was too painful for me to deal with the details. Robert was cremated, which was unusual. He'd always said he wanted to be buried in the family plot. But Thomas said it was more ... sanitary. No body to examine later, Jack said grimly. Clara, I think your husband is still alive. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Clara sat back heavily, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, and terror. But if Robert is alive, she said slowly, then why would Thomas go to all this trouble to hunt us down? Why not just produce Robert and end this charade? Jack considered the implications. Maybe because Robert doesn't know what happened. If Thomas drugged him that night, made it look like he'd died, then hid him somewhere. He paused, following the logic to its conclusion. Clara, if your husband is alive, but doesn't know his own family thinks he's dead, then Thomas has been controlling the railroad empire in his name for months. And if Robert ever surfaced, or if anyone discovered the truth ... Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas would be exposed as a fraud and a kidnapper, Jack finished. He'd lose everything and probably face prison or worse. No wonder he's desperate to get his hands on Tommy. Tommy had been listening to this conversation with wide eyes. Is Papa really alive? He asked, his voice filled with hope and confusion. Clara gathered him into her arms, her own emotions clearly overwhelmed. I don't know, sweetheart. We hope so. But if he is, he's in terrible danger. Jack stood up, his mind already working through the tactical implications of this revelation. If Robert Whitmore is alive, Thomas has to be keeping him somewhere secure, but accessible, somewhere he can be produced if necessary to sign documents, or handle business that requires his personal attention. The family estate, Clara said suddenly. Robert's father built a hunting lodge in the mountains about 50 miles from our home. It's isolated, well guarded, and Thomas has always had access to it. If Robert is being held anywhere, that would be the place, Jack agreed. But Clara, this changes everything. We're not just protecting you and Tommy from greedy relatives anymore. We're dealing with people who have committed fraud on a massive scale, who are holding a man prisoner, and who will kill anyone who threatens to expose them. Clara nodded, her face set with new determination. We have to find him, Jack. If Robert is alive, if he's being held prisoner, while Thomas steals everything he built, ... She looked down at Tommy. And if he could testify about what really happened that night, it would destroy Thomas and his associates completely, Jack said. But Clara, getting to that hunting lodge, finding Robert, and getting him out safely, that's not something we can do from here. We'd need to go back east into Thomas's territory, where he has all the advantages. No, Clara said firmly. We can't risk Tommy if something went wrong. But Mama, Tommy said quietly, if Papa is really alive and he's in trouble, don't we have to try to help him? Jack saw the anguish in Clara's face as she struggled between her desire to save her husband and her need to protect her son. It was an impossible choice, and Thomas Whitmore had engineered it deliberately. There might be another way, Jack said slowly. What if we could force Thomas to come to us? Draw him out here, where we have the advantage? Jack was quiet for a moment, formulating a plan that was dangerous, but might be their only hope. Thomas is hunting for you and Tommy because he needs to eliminate the threat you represent. But what if he thought he'd found you, only to discover he'd walked into a trap? Clara studied his face. You're talking about using us as bait. I'm talking about turning the tables, Jack corrected. Thomas expects to find you helpless and on the run. He's not expecting to face someone who knows how to fight back. From outside came the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving fast through the snow. Jack immediately moved to the window, rifle in hand, while Clara gathered Tommy, and moved to their predetermined safe position. Through the frost-covered glass, Jack could see 4 men approaching the cabin. They rode with the confidence of people who expected no resistance, and Jack recognized the lead rider as Thomas Whitmore from their encounter in town. "It's him," Jack said quietly. "Thomas and 3 others." Clara's face went white, but her voice was steady. "What do we do?" Jack checked his rifle and moved to a position where he could cover the door. "We find out how much they know and how far they're willing to go to get what they want. And if they try to take Tommy," Jack's smile was cold and predatory, "then they'll discover that some mistakes are fatal." The riders pulled up outside the cabin, and Jack could hear Thomas Whitmore's voice calling out, "Mr. Rayner, I know you're in there, and I know you have my family with you. Come out, and let's discuss this like civilized men." Jack positioned himself where he could see out, but remained concealed. "Discuss what?" he called back. "The return of my sister-in-law and nephew to where they belong," Thomas replied, his tone reasonable, but carrying an undertone of threat. "I'm prepared to compensate you handsomely for any trouble they've caused you." "They haven't caused me any trouble," Jack replied. "In fact, I've grown quite fond of having them around." There was a pause, and Jack could see Thomas conferring with his companions. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of politeness. "Mr. Rayner, you're interfering in a family matter that doesn't concern you. I'm giving you one chance to step aside peacefully, and I'm giving you one chance to ride away while you still can," Jack replied. "Because the next words out of your mouth better be an apology, or this conversation is going to take a very different turn." Tommy had crept up beside Jack, peering out the window with fascination rather than fear. "That's Uncle Thomas," he whispered, "the one who hurt Papa." Jack nodded grimly. Now they would find out just how far Thomas Whitmore was willing to go to protect his stolen empire, and whether he had any idea what kind of man he'd chosen to threaten. The moment of truth had arrived, and Jack Rayner was ready for it. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Thomas and his men positioned outside, while Jack maintained his defensive position in the cabin. Clara had moved Tommy to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, a hiding place Jack had prepared for exactly this situation. Now she crouched beside the entrance, rifle in hand, ready to defend her son's hiding place if the cabin's defenses were breached. "Mr. Rayner," Thomas called out again, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm trying to resolve this peacefully, but my patience has limits. Clara and the boy are coming with me one way or another." Jack studied the men through his rifle scope, noting their positions and equipment. They were well armed, but clearly not experienced fighters. Their positioning was poor. They were bunched too close together, and they seemed to expect that threats alone would be sufficient to achieve their goals. "Tommy," Jack called down to the root cellar, keeping his voice calm. "Can you hear me, son?" "Yes, sir," came the muffled reply. "I want you to think about that night you told us about when your papa got sick. Can you remember anything else? Anything that might help us prove what really happened?" There was a pause, and Jack could hear Tommy whispering to his mother. Then the boy's voice came back, stronger now. "Uncle Thomas had a little bottle," Tommy said. "When he gave Papa the drink, he poured something from the bottle into it first. And after Papa fell down, Uncle Thomas put the bottle back in his coat pocket." "What did the bottle look like?" "It was small and dark, like the bottles Dr. Harrison uses for medicine. But it didn't have a label on it." Jack filed this information away. If they could prove that Thomas had drugged Robert Whitmore, it would support their theory that the supposed death had been staged. Outside, Thomas was growing impatient. "I'm going to count to 10, Rayner. If you don't send Clara and Tommy out by then, we're coming in." Jack moved to a different window, one that gave him a better angle on the riders. "Thomas," he called out, "before you do something you'll regret, maybe you should know that we've figured out your little secret." "What secret would that be?" "The one where Robert Whitmore isn't actually dead." The silence that followed was telling. Jack could see Thomas stiffen in his saddle, and the man's companions turned to look at him with expressions of confusion and concern. "You're talking nonsense," Thomas replied, but there was a strain in his voice that hadn't been there before. Am I? Jack called back. Because I've been looking at some very interesting documents, Thomas. Business transactions signed by your supposedly dead brother. Stock transfers. Legal documents. All dated after his funeral. Forgeries, Thomas said. Quickly. Desperate attempts by a disturbed woman to. And then there's what Tommy saw that night, Jack interrupted. What he saw you do to his father. What you threatened him to keep quiet about. Through the scope, Jack could see one of Thomas's companions. Thin man with a nervous manner lean over to speak urgently to Thomas. Whatever he was saying was clearly making Thomas angry. Mr. Rayner, Thomas called out, his voice now openly threatening. You're interfering in matters far beyond your understanding. This isn't some frontier dispute you can handle with a rifle and good intentions. I have resources, connections, influence that reaches all the way to Washington. Cross me, and I'll destroy not just you, but everyone in this godforsaken valley. Jack's response was to work the bolt action on his rifle, the metallic sound carrying clearly in the cold air. Thomas, the only thing you need to understand is this. You're not in Washington now. You're in my territory, threatening my family. And out here, influence doesn't stop bullets. The truth was, Jack was buying time. Martha Henley had promised to send help if trouble arrived, and he was hoping that David, or one of the other neighbors, had spotted the riders and alerted the rest of the valley. 4 against 1 were poor odds, even for someone with Jack's experience, especially when he had Clara and Tommy to protect. But he also knew that every minute they delayed was a minute for the situation to spiral out of control. Thomas had clearly not expected resistance, and desperate men made unpredictable choices. Clara, Jack called softly, are you ready with that signal mirror? Ready, came her quiet reply. On my count, flash it toward the Henley place 3 times. Jack waited until a brief gap in the clouds let sunlight stream down into the valley, then gave Clara the signal. The mirror flashed 3 times, the agreed upon distress call that would bring help if any of their neighbors were watching. Outside, Thomas had apparently made his decision. Spread out, Jack heard him order his men. Surround the cabin. If Rayner won't be reasonable, we'll have to convince him. Jack watched the men move into position, noting their obvious inexperience with this kind of work. They were businessmen, playing at being soldiers, and their amateur tactics would be their downfall. But they were also desperate, which made them dangerous. Tommy, Jack called down to the root cellar, I need you to be very brave now. No matter what happens up here, you and your mother stay hidden until I come get you. Understand? Yes, sir, but Mr. Jack. What is it, son? Are you going to be all right? Jack felt a warmth in his chest at the boy's concern. I'll be fine, Tommy. These men don't know what they're walking into. From his position, Jack could see that one. Of Thomas's men had moved around to the back of the cabin, while another was approaching the barn. Thomas and the 4th man remained in front, but they had dismounted and taken cover behind a fallen log dot. It was then that Jack heard the sound he'd been hoping for, distant rifle fire from the direction of the Henley ranch, followed by answering shots from what sounded like multiple positions. Martha had organized the valley's response, and Thomas's approach had not gone unnoticed. Sounds like your friends are having some trouble, Jack called out to Thomas. Through his scope, Jack could see Thomas looking back toward the valley mouth, with obvious concern. Whatever force he'd brought with him was apparently meeting more resistance than expected. You've made a serious mistake, Rayner, Thomas shouted back. You have no idea what you're dealing with. On the contrary, Jack replied, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A man who drugged his own brother, faked his death, and has been stealing from his estate for months. A man who's been holding Robert Whitmore prisoner while robbing him blind. A man who threatened a child to keep him quiet about witnessing a crime. Each accusation seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. His companions were now looking at him with expressions of shock and growing alarm. You can't prove any of that, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Can't I? Jack called back. Tommy saw you drug his father. We have business documents signed after Robert's supposed death. And when this is over, I suspect we'll find Robert himself, very much alive and very eager to testify about what you've done to him. The thin man who'd been speaking to Thomas earlier suddenly stood up from behind his cover. Thomas, you didn't tell us about any of this, he said loudly enough for Jack to hear. You said it was just a custody dispute. Shut up, Morrison, Thomas snapped. But Morrison was backing away now, his hands raised. I signed on to help recover a kidnapped child, not to cover up fraud and false imprisonment. This is madness. Jack seized the opportunity. Morrison is it. You don't have to be part of this. Walk away now, and when the law gets involved, I'll testify that you weren't a willing participant. Morrison looked between Jack and Thomas, clearly torn. Thomas, if what he's saying is true... It's not true, Thomas said desperately. The man is delusional. Clara has filled his head with lies. But Jack could see that Morrison wasn't convinced. And if Thomas's own people were beginning to doubt him, the situation was about to change dramatically. It was then that Jack heard another sound horses approaching from the direction of town, moving fast. But these weren't more of Thomas's men. Through his scope, Jack could see a group of riders led by Sheriff Williams, the territorial lawman who covered this part of Wyoming. Thomas, Jack called out, I think you're about to have some official visitors. Sheriff Williams and what looks like a federal marshal. Might be a good time to consider surrender. Thomas spun around to look at the approaching riders, and Jack could see panic replacing anger on his face. Whatever influence Thomas Whitmore wielded back east, it clearly didn't extend to territorial law enforcement in Wyoming. This isn't over. Raynor, Thomas shouted, moving toward his horse, but Jack had had enough of threats. Yes, it is, he said quietly, and fired a warning shot that kicked up snow inches from Thomas's feet. Thomas froze, finally understanding that he was dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated by threats or bought with money. The next shot won't be a warning, Jack said calmly. You and your men are going to stay right where you are until the sheriff gets here. And then we're all going to have a nice long conversation about what really happened to Robert Whitmore. As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Jack allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Thomas Whitmore had made the mistake of bringing his corrupt schemes to a place where they couldn't survive contact with honest men willing to fight for. What was right. The battle was almost over, but Jack suspected the war was just beginning. Finding and rescuing Robert Whitmore would require going into Thomas's territory, where the rules were different and the stakes were life and death. But for now, Clara and Tommy were safe, and Thomas Whitmore was about to learn that some forms of justice couldn't be bought or corrupted. The cavalry had arrived, and Jack Raynor was ready to finish what Thomas had started. Sheriff Williams rode up with 3 deputies and a man Jack didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The newcomer dismounted and approached the tense scene with calm confidence. I'm Federal Marshal Harrison, he announced, his voice carrying across the snow-covered clearing. Mr. Whitmore, you and your associates need to step away from your weapons and put your hands where I can see them. Thomas's face went white. Marshal, there's been a misunderstanding. These people have kidnapped my nephew and Mr. Whitmore. Marshal Harrison interrupted. We've been investigating your business practices for the past 6 months. Your nephew and sister-in-law aren't kidnapped. They're under federal protection as material witnesses in a fraud case involving the Transcontinental Railroad. Jack felt a surge of relief as the pieces fell into place. The federal government had already been investigating Thomas's activities. Clara and Tommy weren't just refugees. They were witnesses to crimes that reached far beyond a simple family dispute. Jack, Clara called softly from inside the cabin. Is it safe? Come on out, Jack replied, lowering his rifle. Both of you. Clara emerged first, helping Tommy up from the root cellar. The boy immediately ran to Jack's side, while Clara stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with evident relief and lingering wariness. Marshal Harrison approached them with a respectful nod. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad to see you and your son are safe. We've been looking for you for quite some time. You have? Clara's voice was uncertain. Double quotes, yes, ma'am. Your husband's business partner, Mr. Edmund Cross, contacted federal authorities 3 months ago with concerns about irregularities in the railroad's financial records. When you and your son disappeared, and Thomas claimed you'd taken documents belonging to the estate. The marshal glanced at Thomas, who was standing with his hands raised, his face a mask of defeated fury. Well, it raised some interesting questions. Tommy stepped forward, his young voice clear and determined. Marshal, I saw Uncle Thomas hurt my papa. He put something in Papa's drink that made him sick, and then everyone said Papa was dead, but I don't think he really is. Marshal Harrison knelt down to Tommy's level. Can you tell me more about that night, son? As Tommy recounted what he'd witnessed, Jack watched Thomas's expression shift from defiance to desperate calculation. The man was clearly looking for an escape route, but Sheriff Williams and his deputies had positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at flight. The boy is confused, Thomas said loudly, traumatized by his father's death. You can't take the word of a child against. We can when that child's testimony is supported by documentary evidence, Marshal Harrison replied, standing up. Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you have some papers that Mr. Cross has been very eager to examine. Clara nodded, disappearing briefly into the cabin before returning with the bundle of documents she'd been carrying. These are business records from my husband's office. Stock transfers, correspondence, financial transactions, some of them dated after Robert's supposed death. Marshal Harrison examined the papers quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each document. Mr. Whitmore, these signatures appear to be in your brother's hand, but they're dated weeks after his funeral. How do you explain that? Clerical errors, Thomas said quickly. Pre-signed documents that were misdated when they were filed. All of them? The marshal's tone was skeptical. Mr. Whitmore, we have testimony from 3 different bank officials in New York that you personally presented these documents for processing, claiming your brother had signed them before his death, but asking that they be held until after the estate was settled. Jack could see Thomas realizing that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling. But instead of accepting defeat, the man's desperation seemed to be driving him toward increasingly reckless choices. Even if all of that were true, Thomas said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, you still have no proof that Robert is alive. And without him, everything you have is circumstantial. Actually, Marshal Harrison said calmly, we found your brother 2 days ago. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His face went completely white, and for a moment, Jack thought the man might collapse. That's impossible, Thomas whispered. Mr. Cross's investigation led us to the hunting lodge in the Adirondacks, the marshal continued. We found Robert Whitmore very much alive, though severely weakened by months of captivity and regular drugging. He's currently recovering under medical supervision and is eager to testify about his brother's attempt to murder him and steal his fortune. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert is alive? He's really alive? Yes, ma'am. Weak but recovering. He's been asking about you and your son constantly. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with wide eyes. Now he spoke up, his voice filled with wonder and joy. Papa's alive? We're going to see Papa again? Yes, son, Marshal Harrison said gently. Your father is very much alive and very eager to be reunited with you. But Jack was watching Thomas, and he didn't like what he saw. The man had the look of someone who had nothing left to lose, the most dangerous kind of desperate criminal. Thomas, Jack said quietly, his hand moving back toward his rifle. It's over. Accept it. But Thomas was already moving, his hand darting toward the pistol at his side. If I can't have the fortune, he snarled, then no one can. Jack's military training took over. In one smooth motion, he raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing across the valley. Thomas's pistol flew from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist, and he fell to his knees in the snow, clutching his wounded arm. Nobody move, Sheriff Williams shouted, though the threat was clearly over. Thomas's companions had their hands raised and were backing away from their fallen leader. Marshal Harrison approached Thomas, who was writhing in the snow. Mr. Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, false imprisonment, and a dozen other federal charges. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll want to cooperate if you hope to avoid the gallows. As the lawmen secured Thomas and his associates, Clara sank into Jack's arms, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of relief and emotion. Robert is alive, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. After all these months, all this fear. He's alive, Jack confirmed, holding her close. And Tommy's going to get his father back. But even as he comforted Clara, Jack felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for her reunion with her husband, certainly, but also a deep sadness at the realization that his time with Clara and Tommy was coming to an end. They had become his family, filled the empty spaces in his life that he'd convinced himself didn't need filling. Tommy seemed to sense Jack's thoughts. The boy approached him with serious eyes, still clutching the wooden horse Jack had carved. "For him, Mr. Jack," Tommy said quietly, "when we go back to Papa, will you come with us?" Jack knelt down to the boy's level, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had to say. "Tommy, your place is with your father, in your real home. You have a life there, people who love you, opportunities I could never give you." "But you're part of our family now," Tommy protested. "Mama says so. You protected us when no one else could. You taught me about the animals and how to be brave." Clara approached, her face showing the same conflict Jack felt. "Tommy's right," she said softly. "Jack, you saved our lives. More than that, you gave us back our faith in the goodness of people. How can we just leave you here alone?" Jack looked at both of them, this woman who had brought light back into his world, this boy who had reminded him what it meant to have someone to protect and nurture. The temptation to say yes, to follow them back to their world of wealth and influence, was almost overwhelming, but he also knew that their worlds were fundamentally different. Clara was a railroad heiress, accustomed to society and refinement. Tommy was heir to a fortune and all the responsibilities that came with it. Jack was a frontier soldier who had found peace in isolation and simple work. "Your lives are just beginning again," Jack said gently. "Your husband, your father, needs you now. And you both have healing to do as a family. I would just be—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I would be a reminder of the worst time in your lives." Marshal Harrison approached them, his expression respectful but businesslike. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have a train waiting in Cheyenne to take you back east. Your husband is eager to see you, and there will be legal proceedings that require your testimony." Clara nodded, but her eyes never left Jack's face. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're ready. Sheriff Williams can escort you to town tonight." As the reality of their imminent departure settled over them, Jack felt the walls he'd spent 10 years building beginning to reassemble themselves. It was better this way, he told himself. Clean breaks hurt less than prolonged goodbyes. But as he watched Clara and Tommy gather their few belongings, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The evening passed in a bittersweet haze of final preparations and unspoken emotions. Clara moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, packing their few belongings while occasionally pausing to touch familiar objects. The coffee pot she'd learned to use, the curtains she'd hung, the table where they'd shared so many meals together. Tommy was less successful at hiding his distress. He followed Jack around the homestead as they completed the evening chores, asking endless questions about the care of the animals and peppering him with promises to write letters and visit someday. "The chickens need fresh water every morning," Jack explained patiently as they scattered feed. "And old Bessie, the brown one with the white patch, she likes to hide her eggs under the hay bales in the corner." "I know," Tommy said solemnly. "I'll remember everything you taught me." As they finished with the livestock, Tommy pulled something from his coat pocket, his leather journal, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. "I want you to have this," he said, offering it to Jack, "so you can remember us." Jack opened the journal, finding page after page of detailed sketches documenting their time together. There were drawings of the cattle, the cabin, Clara working in the kitchen, and dozens of small moments that Tommy had captured with his artist's eye. On the final page was a drawing of the three of them standing together in front of the cabin, looking like the family they had briefly been. "Tommy," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion, "this is your work. You should keep it." "I have lots more pictures in my head," Tommy replied with the simple wisdom of childhood. "But you don't have any pictures at all. This way, you won't forget." Jack knelt down and pulled the boy into a fierce embrace. "I could never forget you, son. Never." Inside the cabin, Clara was standing by the fireplace, holding the wooden horse Jack had carved. She turned when they entered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He won't take it," she said softly. "I tried to explain that you made it for him, but he insists it belongs here." "The horse lives here," Tommy said with finality. "This is his home, just like it's your home, mister. Jack, when we come back to visit, We'll know you're both here waiting for us. Jack felt his carefully constructed emotional defenses crumbling. These two people had walked into his life during a storm and transformed everything about it. The thought of returning to his old isolation, to the careful emptiness he'd convinced himself was peace, felt unbearable. Clara, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what he was feeling. She approached him, her green eyes searching his face. What is it, Jack? He struggled with words that had been buried for too long. I need to tell you something before you go. These past weeks, having you and Tommy here, it's been... He paused, looking around the cabin that had been transformed from a shelter into a home. It's been the happiest I've been since before the war. Clara's breath caught. Jack, I know you're... Life is back east, with your husband and your real family. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I need you to know that what we had here, what we built together, it was real for me. You both were real for me. Clara stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his face gently. It was real for me too, she whispered. More real than anything in my old life ever was. They stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Then Clara stepped back, her practical nature reasserting itself. But Robert is alive, Jack. My husband is alive, and he's been suffering while I've been. She couldn't finish the sentence. While you've been surviving, Jack said firmly. While you've been protecting your son and healing from trauma. Clara, you have nothing to feel guilty about. From outside came the sound of approaching horses' sheriff. Williams and his deputies, arriving to escort Clara and Tommy to town. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Jack stepped outside to greet them, his demeanor calm, despite the turmoil in his heart. Sheriff, everything quiet? Quiet as the grave, Williams replied, dismounting. Thomas and his men are secure in the jail in Cheyenne. Federal marshals will be taking them back east for trial. And Mrs. Whitmore's husband? Recovering well, according to the Telegraph reports. He's been asking about his family constantly. Williams paused, studying Jack's expression. You know, Rayner, there's nothing saying you couldn't accompany them back east. I'm sure they could use a friend during the transition. Jack shook his head. Their place is with family. Mine is here. But even as he said the words, Jack wondered if he was making the right choice. Inside the cabin, he could hear Clara's voice, as she helped Tommy into his coat, and the sound pierced him like a physical pain. When they emerged, Tommy immediately ran to Jack, throwing his arms around the tall man's waist. I don't want to go, the boy said, his voice muffled against Jack's coat. I want to stay here with you. Jack knelt down, his hands on Tommy's shoulders. Tommy, listen to me. Your papa has been trapped and alone for months, just like you were trapped and silent when you first came here. He needs you to help him remember how to laugh again, how to be happy. Can you do that for him? Tommy nodded reluctantly. But you'll be here when we come back? I'll be here, Jack promised. Though the words felt like stones in his throat, Clara approached them, her traveling bag in hand. She had changed into her finest dress, the one she'd been wearing when she arrived, now cleaned and mended. She looked every inch the wealthy railroad heiress she was, and Jack felt the distance between their worlds more keenly than ever. Jack, she said softly, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You don't need to thank me, Jack replied. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the knowledge that life can be about more than just surviving from. One day to the next. Clara's composure finally cracked, and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. This isn't goodbye, she said fiercely. It can't be goodbye. No, Jack agreed, though he suspected they both knew it was. It's not goodbye. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat respectfully. Ma'am, we should get moving if we're going to make the morning train. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. She turned back to Jack one final time, and for a moment, he thought she might say something that would change everything. Instead, she reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. This was my grandmother's, she sighed, pressing it into his hand. A compass. She always said it would help find the way home when everything else was lost. Jack unwrapped the silk to reveal an exquisite pocket compass, its gold surface engraved with intricate patterns. It was clearly valuable, both monetarily and sentimentally. "Clara, I can't, please," she interrupted. "So you'll always know which direction leads back to us." Jack closed his fingers around the compass, feeling its weight as a physical reminder of the love he was letting slip away, as they mounted their horses and prepared to ride toward town. Tommy called out one final time, "Mr. Jack, remember to take good care of the animals, and remember that we love you." Jack watched them disappear into the darkness, their figures gradually swallowed by the winter night. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, he stood alone in front of his cabin, Clara's compass warm in his palm. For the first time in 10 years, Jack Rayner understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. And as he looked up at the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky, he wondered if he had just made the greatest sacrifice of his life or the greatest mistake. 6 months later, spring had transformed the Wyoming Valley into a tapestry of wildflowers and new grass. Jack stood in his garden, working the soil with the same methodical patience he brought to all his tasks. But his mind was elsewhere lost, in memories of laughter around his table and a boy's excited chatter as they fed the chickens together. The homestead had returned to its former quiet efficiency, but it felt different now, empty in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of voices or footsteps. Every corner held echoes of the life he'd briefly shared, and even the animals seemed to sense that something vital was missing. He'd received 2 letters since Clara and Tommy's departure. The first had arrived a month after they left, written in Clara's elegant hand, describing their reunion with Robert and the beginning of his recovery. Robert Whitmore had been weak, but determined to rebuild both his health and his relationship with the family he'd thought lost forever. The letter had been warm but careful, full of gratitude, but empty of the deeper emotions Jack remembered from their final night together. The second letter had come just 3 weeks ago, this one written jointly by Clara and Tommy. Clara's portions were updates on Robert's health and the legal proceedings against Thomas, who had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Tommy's sections were filled with drawings of their new life Robert, teaching him to ride in Central Park, family dinners in their grand dining room, tutors and art instructors who praised his natural talent. Both letters had ended with invitations for Jack to visit, promises that he would always be welcome, assertions that they thought of him often. But reading between the lines, Jack could sense the growing distance. Clara and Tommy were rebuilding their lives, reconnecting with Robert, and slowly healing from the trauma that had brought them to his door. Their new happiness was real, and Jack was genuinely glad for them, but it was a happiness that belonged to their world, not his. It was while he was lost in these thoughts that he heard the sound of approaching horses. Jack straightened, wiping his hands on his work shirt as he turned toward the trail. A small party was approaching, 2 riders and a pack horse, moving at the leisurely pace of people on a pleasure journey rather than the urgent gait of those fleeing trouble. As they drew closer, Jack's heart began to race. The lead rider was a woman with dark hair, sitting her horse with the confident grace he remembered so well. Beside her rode a man Jack didn't recognize, tall, distinguished with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority but comfortable in the saddle. "Clara?" Jack called out, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. "Hello, Jack," Clara replied, her voice carrying across the morning air with a warmth that made his chest tight with emotion. As they reached the cabin, Jack could see changes in both his visitors. Clara looked healthier, more settled, her face carrying the glow of someone who had found peace after long struggle. The man with her, clearly Robert Whitmore, appeared older than Jack had expected, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of recent hardship. But there was strength in his bearing and intelligence in his gaze. "You must be Jack Rayner," Robert said as he dismounted, extending his hand with a firm grip. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You don't owe me anything," Jack replied, shaking the offered hand while his eyes sought Clara's face. "Your wife and son are remarkable people. It was my privilege to help them." Clara had dismounted as well, and now she approached Jack with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You look well," she said softly. "The valley agrees with you." "Where's Tommy?" Jack asked, noting the boy's absence with concern. Clara smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since their arrival. "He's at the neighbor's ranch, visiting with the Henley boy. David offered to teach him some advanced riding techniques, and Tommy was beside himself with excitement." We wanted to speak with you privately first, Robert added, his tone serious but not unfriendly. There are things that need to be said. Jack invited them inside, noting how Clara's eyes swept the cabin with recognition and something that might have been nostalgia. The interior was exactly as she'd left it. He hadn't had the heart to change anything about the spaces she'd transformed from a bachelor's shelter into a home. They settled around the same table where Jack and Clara had shared so many conversations, and Robert poured coffee from the same pot Clara had learned to use during those precious weeks. Mr. Rayner, Jack, Robert began, Clara has told me everything about what happened here. How you found them in the storm, how you protected them, how you helped them heal. He paused, looking at his wife with obvious love and gratitude. She's also told me about the feelings that developed between you. Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he met Robert's gaze steadily. I never acted inappropriately toward your wife, he said quietly. But I won't lie to you about caring for her and Tommy. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Robert replied with surprising gentleness. I'm here to thank you for giving me back my family. When I was imprisoned, drugged, helpless to protect the people I loved most, you were there for them. You gave them safety when I couldn't. You gave them hope when I had failed them. Clara reached across the table to take her husband's hand. Robert, you didn't fail us. Thomas deceived everyone, but Jack was there when you needed someone. Robert continued. And from what Clara tells me, he asked for nothing in return except the privilege of caring for you both. Jack wasn't sure where this conversation was leading, but something in Robert's tone suggested this wasn't simply a courtesy visit. The thing is, Robert continued, Clara and I have been talking about the future, about what we want our lives to look like now that we have a second chance at happiness. Robert's recovery has been remarkable, Clara added. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery physically. But more than that, the experience has changed how we think about what's important. Robert nodded. Being helpless, thinking my family was dead, believing I'd lost everything that mattered, it puts wealth and business success in perspective. Clara and I have decided to make some changes. What kind of changes? Jack asked. We're selling the railroad interests, Clara said. All of them. Robert never really enjoyed the business side of things. He inherited the empire from his father and felt obligated to maintain it. But now I realize life is too short to spend it doing things that don't bring joy, Robert finished. We're keeping enough to live comfortably, but the rest will be sold to people who actually want to run railroads. Jack listened, puzzled about why they were sharing these personal details with him. The question, Robert continued, is what to do next. We could stay in New York, live quietly as wealthy retirees. But that doesn't appeal to either of us. What does appeal to you? Jack asked. Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. We want to buy land out here, Jack. A large ranch, maybe with some cattle and horses. Somewhere Tommy can grow up learning practical skills instead of just social graces. Somewhere Robert can recover completely, away from the pressures and memories of our old life. Then somewhere, Robert added with a knowing smile, where we can be neighbors to the man who saved our family. Jack felt his heart stop. You want to move here? To Wyoming? We want to build a new life here, Clara said, together. All of us. Clara told me about your offer to have them stay permanently, Robert continued. She also told me you withdrew that offer because you felt they belonged with me in our real life back east. That's true, Jack said carefully. Well, what if our real life is here? Robert asked. What if the three of us four, counting Tommy, what if we built something new together? Jack stared at them, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You're serious, completely serious, Clara said. Jack, these past 6 months have been wonderful in many ways. Robert and I have reconnected. Tommy has flourished with his father back in his life, and we've put the trauma of Thomas's betrayal behind us. But something was missing. Someone was missing. You became part of our family, Robert said simply. Clara and Tommy made that clear from the first day I saw them. Every story they told, every memory they shared, you were woven through it all. You weren't just the man who helped them. You were the man who completed them. Jack felt tears threatening, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who'd spent years perfecting emotional control. What are you asking? Clara reached across the table to take his hand. We're asking if you'd like to be part of a real family, Jack. Not as a temporary guardian or a helpful neighbor, but as someone who belongs with us permanently. We found a ranch about 10 miles from here, Robert added. Good land, plenty of room for cattle and horses, close enough to town for Tommy's. Education, but far enough out for privacy. We could build something there together, a partnership in every sense. And, Clara said softly, we were hoping you might consider a different kind of partnership as well. Jack looked at her questioningly. Jack, Robert said gently, Clara and I have talked extensively about this. Our marriage was arranged by our families when we were young. We grew to care for each other, certainly, and Tommy is the greatest joy of both our lives. But what Clara found with you, he paused, choosing his words carefully. What she found with you was something neither of us had ever experienced. Love built on choice rather than obligation. Trust earned through hardship. Partnership between equals. Robert, Clara said, her voice emotional, are you certain about this? I'm certain that I want all of us to be happy, Robert replied. I'm certain that the most important thing is keeping our family together, all of our family. And I'm certain that unconventional solutions sometimes work better than conventional ones. Jack struggled to process what they were suggesting. We're talking about redefining what family means, Clara said. About building something new that works for all of us. Robert would be my husband and Tommy's father. You would be ... double quotes. She paused, searching for words. You would be whatever you wanted to be. Partner, protector, the other person who makes our family complete. Think of it as a business partnership with personal stakes, Robert added with a slight smile. We combine resources, share responsibilities, build something greater than any of us could achieve alone. Before Jack could respond, they heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, Jack could see Tommy racing toward the cabin on a borrowed horse, his face alight with joy and excitement. Jack, the boy called out as he dismounted with the reckless confidence of youth. Jack, did Mama and Papa tell you? Are you going to come live with us on the new ranch? Jack looked at the boy, this child who had called him Papa in all but name, who had brought laughter and purpose back into his life. Then he looked at Clara, whose green eyes held all the love and hope he'd thought lost forever. Finally, he looked at Robert, whose generous spirit was offering something Jack had never dared imagine possible. Yes, Jack said simply. Yes, I'd like that very much. Tommy whooped with joy and launched himself into Jack's arms. Clara wiped tears from her eyes as Robert extended his hand again, not in greeting this time, but in welcome to a new kind of family. 6 months later, as Jack stood on the porch of their new ranch house, watching Clara teach Tommy to identify wildflowers, while Robert worked with the horses in the corral, he pulled out the compass Clara had given him on that final night at his old cabin. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the mountains and the vast sky beyond. But Jack no longer needed direction to find his way home. Home was here, in this place they'd built together with these people, who had chosen to make him part of their unconventional but deeply loving family. The wooden horse from his old cabin sat on the mantelpiece inside, and sometimes Jack would catch Tommy talking to it, telling it stories about their new life and promising that it would always have a place in their home. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, and the voices of his family as they worked and laughed together under the endless sky. Jack Rayner had spent 10 years learning to live alone. Now, surrounded by the people who had chosen to love him despite his rough edges and difficult past, he was finally learning how to live fully alive. The storm that had brought Clara and Tommy to his door had been the beginning of everything. And this chosen family, this rebuilt life, this second chance at happiness, this was what came after the storm passed and the sun finally broke through the clouds.